Everybody. Hello to Rhode Island. Hi, everyone. I'm looking at my lighting looks a little reddish. I think it's because I haven't adjusted my lighting for the new hair color. So I'm looking a little red tonight. I wonder if that'll fix it. No, that just makes me look too washed out now. That might be a little better. I'm good. I hope you're all well too. Hope everyone's good tonight. I see some people are having trouble entering the Zoom meeting. So it's good to see everyone. And I want to, hi everybody. And I want to thank everybody who gave me suggestions on social media for what to talk about tonight, since I wasn't, sure what to talk about. Oh, the McCabe's are here. It's good to see you guys. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Some of the compliments are very nice. So I've been trying to find a more gray hair style for me, more suitable to my age. Hello to Indiana and more Virginia. So I found this really cool black and white and gray and blue wig, which I think looks really great. Let me know what you think about the wig. The edge is kind of harsh. I need to work on the netting a little bit to make it look a little less harsh, but I think the color is great. And I did this great hairstyle. What do you think of that hairstyle up there? That's really great. And the back is all nice and curly and beautiful. And it's got some, white on the end. So it's really, really beautiful wig, and it wasn't that expensive. So I thought I would grab it. I have seen portraits of ladies with hair that looks this color, that looks kind of grayish and bluish. And my guess is that they used to use a blue hair powder in their hair, so they would get this kind of bluish color to it. And some of you who've been with me for a while might know that I tried to use some colored hair powders on my darker wig. And of course, they wouldn't show up. You couldn't see them at all. And I tried using a white powder with a colored powder over it, and that just made a mess. So for months now, I've been looking for a wig with the right colors in it. And last week, I was doing my Revolutionary War tour, and unbelievably, there was a wig with all of these color strands in it that kind of perfectly fit the time period. So I snatched it up, and I've been, working on styling it for a couple of days now. So I hope you like it. Oh, Ms. Davidian, thank you. I'm glad you like my hair. Thank you. So I've been working on this, and the style I actually, got from an Indian website for Indian bridal hairdos, because they do all these big poofs with their hair and then they wear it long in the back. But I happen to have this, is very, very, you can see it curly in the back, and isn't a big kind of curly poof back there. So thank goodness for YouTube. I didn't want to do any authentic 18th century hairstyles because, or process, because then I would have had to put pomade and powder in there, and I would have just ruined my wig, and it'd be really hard to wash it out. So I think this looks pretty good. Let's see. People like, why did they use powders in their hair for fashion? And I'm guessing that the ladies that were blondes had a lot of luck with that. They used pink powders and they used blue powders. They were very popular in the court of Marie Antoinette, the powdered hairs. And you can buy 18th century colored hair powders, LBH historical, I think that's what they're called, is where I got mine. They make colored hair powders, and I had absolutely no luck getting them to work in my dark wigs. But this kind of pretty, I think, well replicates what those powdered hairdos looked like. So that was the purpose. They also used pomade in their hair. They did not wash their hair with water like we do. They used a pomade that was based on a type of animal fat. They worked that through the hair, and then they put the white or gray powder through the hair, which is kind of like a potato starch powder. And that would pull out all of the dirt with the fat. It would pull everything out, and then that would make the hair, I've done it with my hair. It makes the hair very soft and pliable to put into those, you know, intricate hairdos, and your hair stands up much better and stuff. So that seems kind of weird to us that they didn't wash their hair the way we do, but they didn't. Now they also use, this is kind of an amusing story, they also use those animal fat pomades in wigs. And there are many incidents, you know, stories where people would find mice and things living in the wigs because they were attracted to eating the fat that was in the pomade. So those are some pretty good stories about wigs and hair in the past. So I'm going to experiment with this a little bit more, but I think it came out pretty good, And it's rather long. I think some of you probably saw the picture on social media that I posted, but it was a great find. It wasn't too expensive. And so if I ruin it, it won't be that big a deal. So let me see. Let me just look at some of the other comments. For all of you who watched my little compilation video of evacuation day, thank you. I think that video came out very well. And for those of you who gave me suggestions about what to talk about tonight, thank you also. Now, someone suggested I talk about spies, and the only reason I'm not going to do that is that I'm in the process of working on a video about the spies who operated in the New York area during the American Revolution. So part of my trip out to Staten Island to the Old Dutch Church was about that. Some of you might know the Messereau family is from there, and the Messereau brothers spied for Washington. So part of my trip out there was about that. So I'm working on a video about the spies, and of course my trip to Robert Townsend's home and all of that is all part of that larger project I'm working on. So I don't want to talk about that tonight because I want you to watch my video when it comes out. So just let me say that I am working hard on the spy story and trying to get it as accurate and amusing as possible. So I've been looking through a lot of original stuff to try to put some really great things in there. So watch for that. What I decided instead was I did get a really interesting suggestion. And that suggestion was that I talk about Mrs. Q's ancestry and also my own family ancestry and whether or not my family dates to the American Revolution. So I thought I would tell you about that and how my own family history helped me to decide who Mrs. Q would be. And I think it's a story you find interesting. A number of people have asked me over the years and have liked the story. So as for my 21st century self, I was born in a town called Binghamton, New York. Some of you might know, upstate New York. And my family all came from Italy, different parts of Italy. My mother's family was from the Naples area, and my father's family was from outside of Rome, or Abruzzi. So he was Abruzzese and kind of an outcast in my town. They didn't really kind of like the Abruzzese people that much. And for those of you who grew up in any kind of Italian neighborhood, you know that just like the old city-states, the Italians have always bickered over who was from where and who had better food, who was more attractive, who had nicer skin, who spoke better Italian, all that kind of regional stuff. So I kind of grew up with that regional stuff as well. And of course, I grew up learning that Sicilians were not Italians. So just some interesting. Now, my good friend, Mrs. Rankich, who's here tonight, was my very good friend growing up, and she grew up in the Irish part of our town. So her family dates back to those Irish immigrants. But the Irish immigrants and Italians came at about the same time, the end of the 19th century. Who makes better wine? Oh, Mrs. Rankich, certainly not any of our neighbors at that time, that's for sure. The stuff was so awful. Loving the wig, thank you so much. Our neighbors made the worst wine and had to drink it to be pleasant, to be polite, I should say. So anyway, back to that story. So My mother's family came in the 1890s and settled around Scranton, Pennsylvania. My father's family came 100 years ago. My grandfather came through Ellis Island in about 1914. He came by himself. He left his wife and daughter behind in Italy, and then sent for them a number of years later. And my father and his brother were then born here, my uncle in 1919 and my father in 1920. So my father was first generation Italian and grew up speaking Italian. Some of you out there who grew up in Italian families like mine, you may have also grown up in a family where it was forbidden to speak Italian in your family. My father would not speak Italian to any of us, although he did to his friends, because their view was that you were Americans now and you should learn English, that English was going to be the language of your success. So I was completely immersed growing up as an American. And I knew very little really about my family's history in Italy and why they left and the whole story of that until I was well into my 30s. I knew nothing about it, as my father would not speak about Italy, never wanted to go there on a vacation, and his view was you're American. So I learned that my history was the American Revolution and American history. And so that is how I got started on American history, was that it was my history, even though my ancestors did not fight in the American Revolution. Let me see if I can find any comments here. I don't want to miss any of your comments. Give me a second. Mrs. Rankage, speaking of Endicott, I will send you an offline message because I need a photo of someone's grave who is in Endicott. And I didn't know your brother, Mr. Page's family was there. So I'll speak to you about that offline because I need a favor, a picture from Endicott. So Endicott is a neighboring town where we grew up in Binghamton. Joshua Mesereau, one of the spies I'm talking about, is buried there as he was granted land in that area for service as a spy to George Washington, but I don't want to give away the spy story. So when I was developing Mrs. Q, I wanted her to have some of that story because obviously I do not look English, Irish, or Scottish, or Dutch. So I needed a story around Mrs. Q that would reflect what I look like. So there was that. And I also wanted to reflect the early colonial diversity of the colony of New Netherland and later New York, a colony that was full of people from different places, although the majority of the people were Dutch, Scottish, Scotch, Irish, or English. There were people here from Northern Europe, Central Europe, Southern Europe, all around the Mediterranean, Northern and Western Africa. So that gave me a little bit of an opportunity to play with Mrs. Q. So I wanted Mrs. Q's parents to be from Italy. But when I started looking at a map of Italy in the 18th century, if you've ever seen one, there is not an Italy as it exists today in the 18th century. Let's see, Bernadette's grandparents are from Naples and Rome, where you have family living in the Binghamton, Syracuse area. A lot of people from Naples and Rome are in the central part of New York, the Binghamton, Syracuse, all through that area. That is true. Our families may even know similar people or have grown up with similar people there. So that's really interesting. So I wanted her to be Italian, but there was no Italy at that time. If you look at a map, you'll see that what is Italy today is divided up as provinces owned by or controlled. Let me got my problem with my bonnet here sliding around. I didn't pin my bonnet on, so it's sliding around a little bit. Let me push this back here. There we go, that's better. So Spain controlled a part of what is Italy today. Naples was a larger thing and controlled part of what was Italy today, Naples and Rome. And then there were parts of Italy today that were parts of Italy then that are Austria and other places today. So the Italy that we think of, Italia, that we think of today is not what existed then. So I had to figure out where my father could potentially be from, that he would trade with England and wind up in America. So that was sort of challenging. So keeping in mind that during the colonial period, all trade had to come to America either through England or on English ships. This is very important and part of the reason we had the American Revolution, right? Because that limited our trade and our opportunities. So anyone in the colonies who was trading with, say, Spain or the city-states that became Italy, or parts of Africa or any place, Asia, all of their goods had to come on English ships that were trading in that region or through London, through agents in London. So that gave me an idea that perhaps my father could have been a trader of some type based in Rome or Naples, and that he was doing business with England. And that on one of his ventures, trading with England, he made his way to America, where he decided he wanted to stay, and sent for his wife, similar to what my grandfather did like 100 years ago now, and that she joined him, and that my sister and I were born here. In real life, there were two of us in my family, me and an older sister. So just like Mrs. Q has Mrs. Van R, I had an older sister as well. So that's kind of true to our family. Now, what my parents did in the modern world has nothing to do with what my parents, Mrs. Q's parents, did in the 18th century. So I made my Mrs. Q's father a trader, a merchant, a gentleman who did business with Europe from America through England. So that would be my father's position. And I made my mother a mantua or a dressmaker. As my mother did sew, that wasn't her profession, and that is where I learned to sew and make all of the things you see me wearing, like my bedgown and my scarf and my hat and everything that you see me wearing. So I kind of related back to that time. Now, in real life, my Mr. Q is Spanish. He is from Puerto Rico, descended from Spanish settlers and conquistadors. So I wanted my 18th century Mr. Q to reflect his family's upbringing. So you may remember that my Mr. Q comes from a family of Spanish fur traders, which is not far-fetched at all, as there were Spaniards all throughout the American colonies, and a number of them were fur traders. So that was really kind of an easy thing to make up for Mr. Q, that he was descended from Spanish fur traders. So that was kind of how I took our 20th century family backgrounds and translated them back to the 18th century to create Mr. and Mrs. Q. And it wasn't unusual in the New York, New Jersey, Philadelphia area to find families from other parts of Europe that were a little bit different than your typical English, Scottish, Scotch-Irish, Irish, Dutch families. So you found a little more diversity. And I'm sure many of you know in Pennsylvania, many people from areas that today are Germany. Germany, as we know it today, also did not exist at that time and was a bunch of different little countries, states, or republics. So similar to Italy at that time. And so we find this kind of diversity of culture and background in the American colonies. And that's something we kind of don't study when we really learn that in school so much, right? We mostly learn that everybody was English. I mean, I don't recall that I even really learned about the importance of the Scots and the Presbyterians and the effect that they had on the thinking here in the colonies and the philosophies that led to rebellion against England. I don't really recall learning about their importance. I don't know if I really even recall learning about the Scotch-Irish. And I only learned about the Dutch, I think, because I grew up in New York. And so you couldn't really avoid learning about the Dutch because we were a Dutch colony. But I really don't think I understood the vast diversity of people who came to America until I started studying original source documents myself and seeing that there were people from all sorts of places that came here to find refuge. People who, not unlike my real life today grandfather, who of course has passed away because he would be well over 100 years old now, my real grandfather, who came from Rome, who came here because there was no opportunity for him. At that time, in the 18th century, as well as the early 20th century, Europe was still very much steeped in a strict class system. And my Italian family were all mountain peasants and farmers. I mean, there was no opportunity for them. There would be no education, no property ownership, no professions, nothing like that, just endless generations of country peasants. And my grandfather saw an opportunity to come to America where his family, his children, and his descendants would live a far better life, a place where his descendants would own land, where they would be educated, where they would be business people, where they could be all of these things that the European aristocrats were, without having to be aristocrats. And so there was that drive in the late 19th and early 20th century to escape that peasant life of Europe. And that was so much true in the 18th century as well. We find people coming to the colonies from Europe for the very same reasons, escaping the very rigid structure there of aristocracy and poor. And, some countries it was worse than in others, depending on how oppressive the aristocracy and how abusive those royal families were. I have a few comments. Give me a moment to look at them. Oh, somebody asked me if I would talk about ghosts tonight, and I said that Mrs. Q really couldn't speak about ghosts because she did not believe in such things, as she was raised a strict Presbyterian. So one night I think I will speak about religion in the colonies and the different denominations that were here, and how the radical Protestant thinking in the colonies led to the American Revolution, because that's a wonderful story in its own right. And we talked a little bit about that at the Dutch Church on Staten Island. Bernadette says her Italian ancestors were stonemasons and jewelers. Yes, very common, stonemasons, jewelers. My ancestors were construction workers and rail workers, worked on railways and things like that. So we find plumbers, all kinds of people who were artisans and things like that, people who were hard laborers as well. And that was true in the 18th century, right? The people who came here were hard laborers, most of them, because they had to build a life here. There was nothing here in most cases waiting for them. Maybe someone sponsored them and they came and were given a small piece of land, but that land had nothing on it. They had to clear the land and find a well and dig a well, find water, build some sort of dwelling, clear a field, try to do something to earn some money so that they could buy a few animals, buy seeds, plant their crops. So it was very difficult. And these were all people who were not afraid of hard work, meaning working sometimes before the sun came up in the morning until after the sun went down at night. And I could certainly say that about my father's generation and his father's generation, those immigrants that came in the late 19th, early 20th century. And I would say in my own neighborhood in Queens, New York, today I see immigrants, many I know, who work very hard jobs during the day, and they deliver food at night in order to help support their families. So I think that's the ongoing immigrant story that dates to the 16 and 1700s, of people who came here to find a better life, expecting that they would work very hard for that, but secure something for their families. So in the case of Mrs. Q's father already had a bit of money in order to be able to get to England as a trader and then make his way to America. So he wasn't quite as poor as some of the other gentlemen of the Hudson Valley. Mrs. Q's parents having at least enough money to have enough leisure time for their daughters, that my sister and I were educated, because I had to find a way that I, Mrs. Q, would somehow be educated at a time when there was not time in most families for people to be educated, much less daughters to be educated. Let's see, I have some more comments. Give me a moment here. I have a comment about people who were the descendants of slaves who built the Wall Street Wall and who built the roads that are now I-95. Yes, New York was the highest holding slave colony north of Virginia at that time. And slavery was ubiquitous all around New York, from the city to the country, everywhere you looked. So yes, that is true, that there was that population as well was here. And all kinds of servants from throughout Europe too, indentured servants. So it was in that way a very complex society for us to understand today, but all of that was happening in New York. Now, my family and some of my live streams, I've talked about that my family were not slaveholders. Mrs. Q's family were not slaveholders because my father, and this gets into the religious beliefs at the time. I present my father as a gentleman who became a Presbyterian when he came here, raised us all in the Presbyterian church and in the belief that we are all the same in the eyes of God, that we don't need an intercessor, we can pray directly to God, and we are all equal in the eyes of God, and that in my father and mother's mind, it was an outrage against God, the idea that any human could own another. So in Mrs. Q's family, there is no slavery, although I have talked about my sister, Mrs. Van R, marrying into a family with slaves and being appalled by that and demanding that her husband free all of the slaves he inherited or she would not marry him, and that he did so in order to marry her. So we do have situations like that that occurred at that time. And there are churches also at the time that supported slavery. As I said, this is a very complex issue that I really don't want to get too deep into tonight. So for my family, being strict in our belief and all being equal in the eyes of God, my family does not hold slaves or believe in slavery, as my mother and father were against it. But I would have grown up, Mrs. Q, with slavery everywhere around me, with many families around me owning slaves, and certainly around my father's shop in New York with all of the wealthy families in New York City owning slaves, many of their fine cooks being African women who were brought here specifically for their cooking abilities. Mrs. Q would be quite familiar with all of that. Mrs. Q would be. Now, just to let you know, growing up in Binghamton, New York, I grew up in a fully integrated community. So to me, also as a modern woman, the idea of people being accepted in any other way other than the quality of who they are as a person was always foreign to me growing up, as I grew up in a fully integrated school and community where we were all working class. So in my community, we were working class Irish, working class Black, working class Italian, working class German, Scottish, mixed everything else. And we were all different religions. I grew up Catholic. I grew up with people who were Presbyterians, Methodists, Baptists, Assembly of God. So we all grew up all mixed in together. And I actually am quite grateful for my upbringing because it made me, a modern woman today, really blind to people's ethnicities or religious beliefs. And I grew up learning to judge people as they were as people. And me growing up today, just as Mrs. Q grew up then, anyone in need was welcome in our home. That came from my grandparents, my mother's parents. So I kind of entwined that into my Mrs. Q character as well, that she would have grown up with that kind of charity from her religious upbringing. So what else? So I tried to put some of that in Mrs. Q. Now, there were some challenges. I was talking about the challenge of Mrs. Q being able to talk to you every week as an educated woman. How, when I sat down to design me, how would I do that? As education, first of all, was rare because people had to work, as I mentioned, from before the sun came up in the morning till well after it went down at night. Where and who would have the time to educate their children? A family would have to have some level of wealth to have enough leisure time to educate their children. And last in line would be daughters, because why at that time would you educate a daughter? There was no opportunity for a daughter to do anything except be a wife, a mother, and to run a household. So it was viewed that, formal education just was not needed for girls. They didn't need that for those, that formal education was reserved for the men, who then would go on and need those skills in order to run businesses and become a lawyer, whatever they were going to do, right? So I had to figure out a way to make Mrs. Q educated. Well, when you get up into the Hudson Valley, you find some interesting things occurring at that time. And one is that the Dutch did tend to educate their daughters more often than the other groups did. And some of the wealthier Scottish families did as well. So we find families like the Jays, the Van Rensselaers, the Schuyler's, names you may have heard of, and the Livingstons educating their daughters also. Now, their daughters are not going to be educated at the same level as their sons, but they will have a good educational background. They will be able to read and write. They'll have some exposure to math and geography, the sciences, literature, history, maybe even some classics, some Latin and some Greek, perhaps some astronomy, whatever the boys are being taught up until the time they're 14 or 15 and go off to college. Some of the daughters would be exposed to as well. So since my father, Mr. C, as he would have been, only had daughters, I decided that because he himself was such a lover of intellectual pursuits and knowledge, and believed that knowledge was integral to realizing all of your potential as a human being, all of us equal in the eyes of God, again, that he would educate his daughters. And so I have made up the story that my sister, Mrs. Van R, and I were educated, to make it fun, by the old schoolmaster Ichabod Crane, just to give you some fun stories now and then about our upbringing. So in that way, I was able to weave in the story of why my sister and I are somewhat well educated. I would not be as educated as a man if I were to pursue those. That would have been education I pursued on my own when I became an adult lady. So when you see me with my good friend James Madison, and we're sparring back and forth, and Mr. Madison remarks on, how remarkably well educated I am for a lady, that would all be self-education, or being able to find gentlemen in the town willing to discuss those topics with me and to help me learn them better. So that would be how I would have attained the knowledge that I bring to you every week when I get into subjects like philosophy or the law, the common law, the operation of the parliament, things like that would be things I would have had to learn on my own with the assistance of other people in the town, and of course, Mr. Q. But remember, Mr. Q was a fur trader, which meant Mr. Q did not attend college. Mr. Q, you might remember, I told his story before, went off at the age of 13 to conduct his first fur trade with the tribal people of the Great Lakes. And that would have been his coming of age journey. And so Mr. Q would not have been educated, beyond the basics either, as it would not have been necessary for him as a fur trader to have been so. Perhaps Mr. Q might have had a brother who was more highly educated and became a lawyer or something, but it's not in my story. So Mr. Q also, his education in other subjects would have come as a result of his own curiosity and desire to have that knowledge. So that would be how we would be educated people, even though we come from traditions at that time where education was not a priority. At that time, families for whom education for their children was a priority were families who already were largely successful, where the men were gentlemen farmers, or they were very wealthy tradesmen and merchants. They owned fleets of ships, or they were very successful lawyers, or things like that. They would have been educating their children just as a regular procedure or process in their families. But newer families like mine would be new to education and just beginning to educate their children. So there was that part I had to put in there. How would Mrs. Q be educated when ladies generally were not educated? So that was kind of how I weaved that into my story. Now, another thing I had to weave into my story was, how the heck would Mrs. Q be doing business with all of these ship captains, tradesmen, what's the other word I'm looking for? The guys who were the middlemen, agents, and all of these men. How in the world did Mrs. Q get respected and accepted by these men? And that was really a hurdle to try to figure out how that could have been done. Let's see. Oh, Mrs. McCabe asked me, did women in the 18th century become lawyers or doctors? Oh, definitely not lawyers, as that required an education that was not available to women. Doctors, that is a very interesting question, as there were ladies in the colonies who were taught by the native people, or perhaps by their fathers who were doctors, how to also become the family doctor. And there is, oh, what was her name? I have a whole collection of stories written about just such a colonial woman who was the town doctor. I forgot where, actually for many towns, for a great, distance radius of mileage, and was taught by her father. Her father was the country doctor, and she became the country doctor after him. And it's a fascinating story. I found the book by accident in the late 1980s, and I had no idea that there were women who were doctors at that time, but there were. So there would have been women. Certainly there would have been many women who were taught by the Native women and Native doctors and healers how to use native herbs, roots, all kinds of things to cure. Women who would have been taught that. It was women, of course, who delivered babies, who worked as midwives, and who treated many of the, quote, women's ailments. So yes, there would have been women who were what we would call today doctors, but no lawyers, as they were not allowed into college, and you had to go to college in order to clerk as a lawyer. So that's not going to be coming for the ladies for quite a long time. What else do I want to explain? Those of you who watched the video or who saw the evacuation day tour saw when Mrs. Q shockingly asked Mr. Hamilton whether or not she would be able to own her own land. This is based on when New York was a Dutch colony and the ladies owned land. Many of the ladies in New Amsterdam were businesswomen. A couple of them had opened expansions of their fathers' or brothers' businesses based in Amsterdam. They were the colonial base of that business. They owned the business, they owned property, and they expanded and acquired more property. One of those women, I've forgotten her name, was one of the wealthiest women in New Netherlands. When the English arrived, English law made that impossible. Right? English women were property, so women could not own property or businesses. And at that time, all of those properties had to be turned over to a male living relative. And there's a good book called The Women of the House about how many of the Dutch families then still controlled their businesses in reality, even though a man, a son, a brother, or someone else might technically own that business. Now, in the tour, Mr. Hamilton did remind me that New York was the only state after the Revolutionary War, colony before that, that did not allow a gentleman to dispose of property he obtained through his wife without her express written permission, and that permission had to be given with her alone, separate from him, in an environment where she felt safe to do so, to make sure she wasn't under duress. So at least women in New York had that level of protection. So in my Mrs. Q storyline, although I inherited my store and the property that it's located on and the building that it's in, it's all technically owned by Mr. Q and not me, although I run it. And so my question from Mr. Hamilton was, now that we are no longer under English rule, will we return to the Dutch tradition of allowing ladies to own their own property? And you might remember my sister, Mrs. Van R, was outraged that I would ask such a radical question. You may not think that's a radical question, but that was a perfect response from my friend Ruth, who was playing Mrs. Van R, as most ladies at that time would have been shocked. Even Mr. Hamilton looked shocked when I asked it. So that was a question that was way ahead of its time. And I'm still trying to find out. I haven't had a chance, but I do want to look through New York legal records to find out when that changed and when women were allowed to own their own properties. Now, if your husband died, you could inherit those properties from your husband. But you couldn't go out and buy property from someone or something like that. So I want to find out when that changed. Let's see. What else? Another factor that I was, challenged with, I was mentioning, was how would a lady be accepted in such a rough male profession as being a merchant? And so then I looked back and I tried to find a woman merchant of that time. And incredibly, I found one, a very well-known one. Her name was Mary Spratt Prévost Alexander. Her husband was James Alexander, a very prominent lawyer in New York City in the 1730s. He was a part of the Zenger trial, which created the free press in New York. And her son, William Alexander, was a major general in the Revolutionary War. He was commander of the 1st New York. No, that was McDougal commanded the 1st New York. I'm sorry. Stirling was above him. He was called Lord Stirling. So he's Major General William Alexander. Lord Stirling was her son, a Revolutionary War hero. Now, I read a commentary at the time that said that the gentleman in the town said there wasn't a ship and a dock anywhere in New York that did not have items bound for Mary Alexander's shop, and that she was one of the wealthiest people in New York. Although if you were to see the one portrait I found of her, she looks like a very plainly dressed lady. Very plainly dressed woman of Dutch background. She's dressed in the Dutch style. Very plain dress with an apron and a little bonnet. And she does not look like a wealthy woman at all, but apparently she was. So that meant Mary Alexander must have been a member of the Chamber of Commerce, and she must have dealt very well with the ship captains and the agents and the shipping companies. So that gave me some idea that it was possible for a lady to do that. And then I started thinking about what would the qualities have to have been, what would my father have had to do to help me in that regard? And of course, he would have taken me around when I was a girl, introducing me to everyone and preparing me for the environment. So I would know what the environment was like, and I would not be afraid in it. I would not be intimidated by it. I also just hypothesized that my father would teach me all kinds of things about how to extend credit, how to keep credit, how to deny credit, how to keep all of the books, how to keep inventory, how to decide what to put in my shops, how not to get taken by agents and traders who might be trying to sell me things that are junk, that he would have had to taught me all of those things. And I would have had to learn those things while still remaining very ladylike, right? So that would have been quite a challenge for young Miss C growing up, and would have made perhaps Miss C, as I was, a not very desirable wife for most gentlemen of that time, because that really isn't what gentlemen were looking for in a wife, right? They were looking for a woman to have children, keep the household, run the household within a budget, keep everything going, make sure everyone has clothes, do the sewing, do the animal husbandry, all of that stuff. So who in the world would want to marry a lady who's a shopkeeper and probably not doing all of those other things? And so, of course, we'd have to guess that Mr. Q would be a very special gentleman, and that he would fall in love with me for my unusual traits, rather than for what would be the more regular traits they may be looking for in a woman. And I do talk about occasionally, and joked a bit on the tour we did, that my sister, Mrs. Van R., mastered all of those feminine things so brilliantly that the daughter of a dressmaker and a merchant married a Van Rensselaer. So you can see how well mastering those things served my sister, who, like Alexander Hamilton, married up when she married. Well, I think that was more common, or you might think it was more common for the ladies to marry up, but I assure you many gentlemen did as well. So it wasn't that unusual. Those of you who love those English dramas, you know that already. Let me look, there's a lot of comments here I want to talk about. A bunch of you are having a conversation about slavery. Yes, Mr. Linden is talking about on YouTube. I should tell you the story of how William Alexander became known as Lord Stirling. The Alexander family were from Stirling, Scotland. They came to America, and you probably know when the English took over Scotland, they stripped all of the Scottish families, well, the ones that weren't loyal to them, of their land, and gave it to English lords. William Alexander spent years petitioning English courts for the return of his family's land in Scotland and the return of the title Earl of Stirling to his father. His father kind of gave up and didn't care about it anymore, but William Alexander pursued this. He hired lawyers in London. They argued to the Parliament, and I think his lawyers even told him, he was wasting his money, that these guys in the Parliament, who are the guys who were benefiting from, basically the English stealing land and giving it to their friends, were never going to rule in his favor. And not only did they not rule in his favor, they also ruled that he must cease and desist using the title Earl of Stirling, that the family must give up that title. Well, it was right around that time, that the Continental Congress was meeting and doing all kinds of radical things and looking for all kinds of ways, we might say in the 21st century, to stick it to England. And so they voted to name him the Earl of Stirling in America, and thus he became Lord Stirling, and is the only gentleman ever to receive a title of aristocracy or peerage. And it was done not to make him a lord, but just to kind of stick it to their English counterparts in the Parliament. So even Washington wrote to him as Major General Lord Stirling. So everyone referred to him as Stirling. So it's kind of a fun story. He is buried at Trinity Graveyard behind the church. The graveyard has been closed for 2 years. The last time I saw the grave, it was in a terrible state of disrepair. They have just done about a $100 million restoration of Trinity Church and the grounds, and I am trying to get permission to walk back there and look at the restored grave site, because Stirling is one of my personal favorite people from New York during the Revolutionary War, a man of great honor and distinction, as was his father, who argued the Zenger trial and was disbarred for a time for representing Mr. Zenger. So if I can get back there and get a picture of the grave, I'll share it with you and tell you more about the story. So that was Stirling. So that is kind of the story of how I created my 18th century character based on who I really am. I wanted to recognize my real life family, and they're coming here from another country and creating a really nice life for their descendants. And I wanted to try to find a way to represent that in the 18th century, as that's what people did then too. And I think I did a pretty good job of weaving it together. I hope you like the story. I hope you like that story. And if there's any other things you'd like to know about Mrs. Q, or some ideas you have of things Mrs. Q could talk about, or things Mrs. Q may have had to confront in her life, let me know, because that helps me flesh out my character of Mrs. Q and make her more lifelike. I'm always reading and working on it and trying to figure out, how to make, an 18th century woman accessible in the 21st century. It's not that easy, So as I said, having been raised a strict Presbyterian in my home, I would not believe in ghosts, nor would I ever tell any stories of the supernatural, as it would be a very dangerous door opening to evil. So in our home, we would not discuss anything like that, and nor would we listen to any music considered to be the devil's music. So that would be, my 18th century upbringing. So I hope you are all doing well, and that you had a great Thanksgiving holiday. And I will be here on and off over the Christmas holidays. In the 21st century, my real Mr. Q is retiring this December. So we may be doing some traveling at the end of the month. So I may not be here at the end of the month. I'm not sure. He may retire and just sleep for a few months, because he's a very hard job that he's done for many years. But I'll try to be here every week and every Friday through December. I'll do my best to be here with you. And I hope you'll continue watching and supporting me. Oh, before I forget, next year, I am going to open a real life Mrs. Q store where you can help support my effort by buying items from my shop. I'm looking for a name of my shop. And I've thought of names. If you know 18th century names, send me some that you think would be good. I've been thinking of something like the rose and the dove, or, something like that. I need a name of my shop so that I can have an artist design a beautiful logo with some items on it representing my shop. So please send me some ideas for my shop name. And I'm going to be selling all kinds of nice historic things. And since I am a seamstress, I think I will be making some things myself to sell in that store. So you can buy some genuine made by Mrs. Q items. And I think that will be really nice. And, I hope you'll support me that way. Oh, Mrs. Rankich says a Mrs. Q shop sounds awesome. Thank you for your support. I know you'll be out there helping me and giving me some advice on how to do this. Oh, Mrs. McCabe has a question. Mrs. McCabe says her great-grandparents came to New York from Ireland in the 1840s and 50s. One of my great-grandfathers was a blacksmith and another was a leather worker. Thank you so much. Yes, the great contribution of the Irish migration of the 1900s on our city and our nation. Definitely, not to be forgotten. So many people who came to America over hundreds of years who've helped contribute to what it is today. People who came willingly and people who came unwillingly, who all made it what we have today. All of their stories, very important to remember today. And I would suggest none to be remembered at the cost of forgetting any of the others. They all have rich, interesting, fascinating stories of how they helped make us what the United States of America is today. Where will the shop be? I don't know. It might be an Etsy shop. It might live on my Patriot Tours website. It might live somewhere else. I haven't got that far, but it will be an online store, yes. And some of those things will be available if you take my tour. You can order them and I'll just bring them along with me on the tour if you order something. And I try to think of some of the things I'd like to stock. I might stock some actual 18th century ladies cosmetics and hair items, just so you can buy them if you want to see what they're like. Some maybe blushes or lipsticks, the white face powder, maybe some hair powders, just if some of you ladies would like to see. Maybe some of the scents they had at the time. Lavender and rose were very popular scents, as was orange blossom. So maybe some things like that too. What goods does Mrs. Q sell? I think I just answered that. Also, maybe some fabrics and some handmade items. I might make some scarves for you. Maybe I'll make some bonnets. And if anyone would like an entire outfit, well, maybe you could special order that outfit and I might take your measurements and make you a full 18th century outfit if you would like. So all kinds of things like that will be available. And if you want to try stays, I'll make you some stays, although I don't know why you would want to wear them, but maybe you just want to try. So again, thank you so much for sticking with me again this week. It's been a pleasure, and I will hopefully see you all next Friday. Everyone take care. I hope you have a healthy and a lovely weekend and a week next week. Goodbye, and thank you for supporting me.